Welcome, students. I hope you're feeling well today. Let me go ahead and open us in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this wonderful day that you have given me and given us. That's a blessing on students no matter where they are. Again, I understand that coming off the long break, it may be a little difficult to get back to school, but you're with us. I pray for wisdom, I pray for strength, and the ability to find your grace in these days. If anyone is not feeling well, I ask for your healing. Again, we lift up our world. Thank you, Lord God, for the ability to be able to function academically through Zoom and other media. Again, I lift up those who are not able to do so. Be with us as we progress in our material today in history, looking at secular, Marxist, and postmodern perspectives. Help us to apply knowledge that we have previously learned and look among persons and events in our world and to be able to see these things play out and to be able to speak to these things in knowledge. Again, we ask all these things in your holy name. Amen. Okay, thank you so much for praying with me. So this session, I want to begin with this journal entitled Better Yet. So here it is. In 25 words or more, answer the following. Is the world better today than it was 50 years ago? Again, is the world better today than it was 50 years ago? Why or why not? Go ahead and take a few moments now to work on that. If you haven't already, go ahead and even pause the video so you can really think this through. Okay, I trust that you've paused the video and you've worked on that. Let's go ahead and cover our objectives for today. So as I said in my opening prayer, today we're explaining secularist, Marxist, and postmodern understandings of history. Much of the things that we'll be covering today, you have a good foundation for already. So I'm going to be asking that you try to recall with me some of those things as we progress. So first, let's take a look at the secularist perspective. So as we already know, secularism is a very hopeful worldview or religion, placing a high degree of confidence in human capability. It's based in part on evolutionary developments, and it sees history primarily as a narrative of progress. So we go from, again, the progression of biological organisms to the complexity and development of human civilizations. And there are many different thoughts that come to mind when we think about the nature of progression. For some of the early secularists, they believe that because evolution is a biological and seemingly necessary process, then also our developments historically and our progressions are of the same necessity. And we had versions of that progress looked at in earlier days from some pretty, I think, controversial perspectives. One person I want to bring to mind is the name Herbert Spencer. This is a person who believed that in looking at the various societies around the world, we see varying levels of development. And he believed that evolutionary theory could justify those varying levels of development. That is, some people groups were, by their very nature, more progressed or evolved than others, and thus their societies and their histories were more progressed and evolved. Today, secularists find that highly problematic, but we still have this understanding that we should be progressing. And if a group or a nation, let's say, isn't as technologically savvy as we are, then there's some work that they need to do to attain our status or to arrive to the 21st century, if you put it that way. Even that mode of thinking, that mode of language is suspect of this position, right? Persons and places that are let's say perhaps less economically developed, if they're living today, are they not in the 21st century? Yeah, but when we use that term, we have a lot of baggage that we laid with that phrase, 21st century. We have this idea that if we have progressed to this particular point, then we should be, let's say, scientifically, technologically, ethically, philosophically, at some particular point that's more advanced. than we were prior. And so I think all of this portrays a secularist mentality of history, namely that it must be progressive. So, a few additional things that I would like to raise to your attention. Again, I mentioned that earlier thinkers believed that progress was built within the foundations of the natural order. However, as time has gone along, human beings have now taken the reins of our journey, and we are the ones who are directing our future and are directing progress. So there's an interesting tension. On the one hand, we have necessary processes that are leading us to progress. On the other hand, human beings are freely choosing to construct societies in which there's progress. So this latter position is known as social progress. Again, it's the belief that societies will continually improve by human initiative or by humanity's will. So, right now, I just want to take a break and ask that you recall with me what you wrote in your journal. Again, the question was: is today, that is, where we are today, more advanced, or is it? Are we further ahead today as a global community than we were 50 years ago? Why or why not? So if you shared that we are rather further advanced than we were 50 years ago, I want to kind of postulate some things that you may have brought up. Again, this may not be true, but I think these are some pretty common things that people tend to bring up. We look at the field of science and technology primarily, and we say, okay, at this point in history, 50 years ago, we did not understand this or we did not understand that, and today we have a much better understanding. For example, maybe someone could bring up the possibility of our knowledge of vaccines. I'm thinking about that right now, obviously, because of what's going on today. Although we are still crippled by a global pandemic, we are perhaps much more able to come up with a treatment today than maybe we were in the 50s, for example. So that's something that may come up. Again, science and technology. Other people point to liberation movements. So in the 50s, 60s, particularly in the American context, Black and brown people were oppressed and disenfranchised politically, didn't have certain opportunities, and look at where we are today, right? We've had President prior to President Trump, President Barack Obama, first African American president. We have Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, as a female. We have all of these developments, right, and liberation. And so people may point to these things and say, see, yes, we're progressing. We could also speak about education. In the 50s, maybe there were some persons who have higher degrees, but now we have more people today with college and graduate level degrees than we've had in any other point in history. Not to mention simply cultural competency. Our communities are more integrated, and we have more of an understanding of people from a variety of walks of life. So all of these things, and I think this is valid to point out. See, we are more progressed, we are more advanced 50 or today than we were 50 years ago. But I would also have to say that I think our culture, being predominantly secularist, teaches us to focus on those things and not to look at some other things. So here's some other counterexamples, and maybe you thought of these if you disagreed, or maybe you said, well, we can't know, or yes, in fact, we are worse than today than we were 50 years ago. So some might point to the fact that, and you may not know this, but there are more people enslaved today than any other time in human history. Again, we're familiar perhaps with the North American slave trade and other forms of slavery that have happened in the past, and by all means, those things were horrific. But we still have slavery with respect to child labor, uh, adult slavery with respect to labor, but of course, what comes to mind for most of us would be sexual exploitation. There's more sexually sex slaves today than there have been in any point in history. And that's something that is also true that we may not think about. Beyond that, certainly there have always been drugs, but today we have a great opioid crisis. Sorry, forgive my tongue being tied. Not only do we have people addicted to illegal drugs, but people who have been prescribed medicines legitimately have also abused those medications. And it seems as if our society doesn't know how to deal with this great opioid crisis. And again, that's something that's true that we shouldn't fail to acknowledge. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out weapons of mass destruction, right? Technology, yes, has brought many wonderful things to our world, but has also brought many devastating things to our world. Now, 50 years ago, we did see the use of these weapons of mass destruction, or more than 50 years ago, right? World War II. But we have more nuclear weapons today than we had back then. And we have people, government leaders, actively threatening to use those weapons. So I think we need to have a balanced perspective when we try to assess, are we ahead of where we were 50 years ago? And with that in mind, I want to point this out. Again, I kind of alluded to in my last comment. Secularists have this rose colored perspective often of where we are in a society. Despite global wars, disease, urban decay, any evidence to the contrary, secularists are committed to this view of historical progress, often based primarily in their understanding of science and technology. So I want to read this quote from Paul Kurtz, again, prolific secular humanist, one of the leading voices in his day. He said, using technology wisely, we can control our environment, conquer poverty, markedly reduce disease, extend our lifespan, significantly modify our behavior, alter the course of human evolution, cultural development, unlock vast new powers, and provide humankind with unparalleled opportunity for achieving an abundant and meaningful life. And I think to a large extent, yes. Have we? Will we? I think is the question, right? So again, keep all of these things in mind. We have a varied history, but secularists tend to focus on the progressive nature of our societies. Okay, let's move along now to the Marxist perspective. So again, if you remember our discussions previously, you understand that Marxism is quite similar to secularism in the sense that it affirms a narrative of progress. It denies the legitimacy of God. However, progress in Marxism isn't so much due to science and technology. It's primarily due to economic conflict or class struggle. So in the fall, we discussed this term dialectical materialism. Dialect, right, is connected to the word dialogue, which means kind of two voices going back and forth. And we discussed that at various points in history, we had classes that were in conflict. We had during the days of Rome, the slave and the citizens. Again, not necessarily an outright physical brawl, but there were tensions between these classes. Moving along to feudalism, we have this tension between the lord and the serf. Again, less oppressive, but still difficulties. And then during the days of Karl Marx and even today, the capitalist scheme, we have a bourgeois or wealthy class, and we have a class that is poor, or the proletariat. Again, it's not saying that one can't move from one class to the other, but there are great difficulties in doing so. So another way of understanding dialectical materialism is this term historical materialism. And it's fundamentally the same concept. However, instead of focusing on the dialects, that is, the opposing classes, we simply name the epochs or the moments in history. So moving from tribalism, which predates what I shared with you before, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and ultimately communism. Again, as you already know, the current place, according to Marxism, that we are in is capitalism, the struggle between the haves and the have-nots, or between the bourgeois and the proletariat classes. So again, concerning the nature of how history progresses, not simply through class conflict, but is it conflict that is forced, or is it conflict that is chosen? Marxists are divided on that, but many Marxists do believe that human beings have a free will, yet this free will is restrained to some extent. I think there is something of an implicit or seemingly contradictory nature to this, but see if you can follow me. The idea is that individuals and even groups can make many choices, but their choices are limited by their experiences. And thus, they will inevitably choose things that will lead us towards a communist state. Again, not every choice is determined necessarily, but the types of choices that we are biased towards, I think that's a good way of saying it, the types of choices that we are biased towards will lead us to communism. So, one more slide concerning Marxism. Again, just recapping, we talked about class struggle and the various epochs or moments in history. We talked concerning how Marxists want to affirm free will and that we are choosing things freely, yet we are still biased towards a particular end. Now, when Marxists look back in history, again, they tell the narrative to fit their worldview. And this would seem to suggest that they're not being objective. And I think some Marxists would say, yes, this is objectively so, but other Marxists, and I have one name here, I think this is a great example, Howard Zinn, who wrote a history of the United States, is clearly acknowledging, hey, I'm not being objective. In fact, we can't be objective, especially if there's something that we want. So consider this quote. He says, objectivity is impossible and is undesirable. Because if you have any kind of social aim or social aspiration, then it requires that you make your selection on the basis of what you think will advance the causes of humanity. So again, what he's saying is, I am not objective, nor am I trying to be. I have a social aim. There is a particular direction that I want history to go in, and I'm going to tell previous history to accomplish that aim. And just want to note here that the underlying is my emphasis. So keep that in mind. Marxists, some of which may say, yes, we can have an objective telling, and objectively speaking, we are leading in this direction. But other Marxists, such as Howard Zinn, are saying, actually, I'm not being objective. We are trying to achieve a particular aim. So that is a natural segue to looking at postmodern perspectives. So again, if you recall anything of what we discussed previously, postmoderns are committed to saying that we either have no objective reality and truth, or we have no access to objective reality and truth. And so this is in stark contrast to history as it is traditionally understood. That is, traditionally, historians are trying as much as possible to be objective. Again, I just noted a historian who wasn't, but traditionally, historians are trying as much as possible to do that. Postmoderns are saying that not only is it impossible, but you can't even approximate objectivity. Again, let me say this again. Not only is it impossible, but we can't even approximate objective history. All written truth claims, therefore, must be deconstructed to show that they are not objective. So that is the postmodern aim. Again, you recall this understanding of deconstruction, trying to point out hidden assumptions, hidden ideologies within a text to disabuse the tellers of their power, right? Well, what is a historical account then? Just take a moment and think about that before I proceed. If we are not objective, if we can't even approach objectivity, then what are we doing when we're drafting history? What genre would history fall under? So one could say it a variety of ways, but I think Michel Foucault basically said that history is political fiction, all history. Consider this quote, and I want to try to reflect on it a little bit. I think it is a little bit obscure, but see if you can track with me. This is Foucault speaking. He says, "It seems to me that the possibility exists for fiction to function in truth, for fictional discourse to induce effects of truth. One fictions history on the basis of a political reality that makes it true. One fictions a politic not yet in existence on the basis of historical truth." So to break down this a little bit before I ask that you consider some things in your own experience or things we discussed last semester, I see it as having at least two parts. The first part, before the ellipse, we see that Foucault is saying that fiction can have the impression of truth. In the second part, after the ellipse, we see that there's an intentionality happening with this fictioning of history. That is, we have a political reality that justifies the fiction that we want to tell. And in the second part, we have historical truth. And I'd be interested to find out a little bit more what he means by that. But he says we have historical truth that, again, justifies the political fictions that we draft or the political systems that we draft. There's certain historical truths or moments. Let's say, for example, at the founding of our nation, our founder said that, Britain was tyrannical in its rule. They saw these things as historical truths, and therefore we must create a new politic to answer or address those historical truths. So there's a cyclical nature to this to some extent. So now I want to ask you this question before I kind of share with you the things that I brought up previously. Where in your life, personally or either beyond personally, let's say on the community stage or the national stage, have you felt something was true, but then later discovered that it was not true? It was a fiction, but it had the force of truth. Again, it had the force of truth. Think about that for a moment. Again, either in your personal experience, it could be you personally, perhaps you witnessed something, a fiction had the force of truth, or perhaps on the communal or the national stage. Okay, so I'll share with you first something that came to mind readily for me, and then I'll share something that I shared in the fall. So many of you, maybe all of you, are too young to remember this, but immediately after 9/11, there was a grand narrative that was being told to us. And again, I'm not trying to do any blame here. I'm just simply stating this, that a certain nation was behind the attacks, right? A certain nation was behind the attacks on our nation, and we need to retaliate. Then later we come to find out that we have certain Islamic extremists that aren't necessarily tied to that particular nation, but yet that narrative had a strong pull on the American people, right? It felt true. And so we acted accordingly. The other example that I'll bring up is what I mentioned to you all last semester. When I was introducing postmodernism, I brought up this narrative, this autobiography of a woman whose brother was murdered by socialists. If you recall the work was I. Rigoberto Menchu. You can go back and look at that slide if you like to see that, students on the undergrad and graduate level were required to read this particular text, and it had a strong message, and it had a forcefulness. Later, it was found out that this, in fact, was not true. Her brother was not killed under the circumstances in which she articulates, yet her award was not taken away, and people still read this work and they still call it truth or a truth. And so I think here are some examples that I would say the postmodern would look at these things and they would say, hey, let's look at this thing that happened post 9/11 and the way our nation responded. Let's look at this work or whatever, and basically say that all history is like that. We simply may not know, right, that it's like that. Something is left out, something is obscured, something is not exactly accurate, but it gives the impression or the force of truth. And so that's the nature of history, no matter what we do. And this is a distinct claim from saying that, we're telling the truth, although there are certain aspects that are neglected. Or to say it differently, we are telling the truth even though we have a unique perspective. The postmodern claim is that your unique perspective is the only thing that is truth, right? Your unique perspective is a truth, and another's unique perspective is a truth, and neither one is approximating what happened, right? We can't get there. Hopefully, you see what I'm trying to say, this fine distinction I'm trying to draw. Okay, so a few more slides, and then we will be done for today. Again, if we can't approximate objectivity, all we're doing is telling fictions, then what's the goal of a postmodern historian? Again, postmoderns may deconstruct other historians to showcase the problems that they see in their narratives, but if a postmodern is him or herself a historian, then what are they trying to do? This is where we get to historical revisionism. It is the act of reinterpreting the past to serve an ideological purpose. So if you recall with me, again, when I was discussing the law unit, I mentioned that. Actually, I'll wait on that. Let me share this, and I'll mention that again. So, some examples of historical revisionism: feminist tellings of history can be like this. I think most feminists would classify themselves more postmodern than not, but to be fair, some feminist accounts of history would be historical revisionist in nature, in the sense that it's not only telling a narrative from the perspective of women or for women, but it's trying to shape history to be told that way in the future. It has this ideological perspective or purpose of saying, hey, this is what matters most, not simply this is what matters. This also matters. Again, hopefully you understand that. Again, this is what matters most, not simply this is something that also matters. Liberation documents or histories can do this. Again, I gave you an example previously with Howard Zinn, historian that wrote on a lot of matters, but one of his popular works was telling the American story from the perspective of a socialist or a Marxist perspective, with a perspective, or with rather an intention to say, hey, this is what matters most, or this is what we should focus on. And this last comment, and I'll circle around to what I was going to say previously in the law unit. Many postmoderns believe that oppressed groups are the best historians and are most likely able to uncover past injustices. So with respect to law, again, previously I said that some people, and I gave you the example of Justice Sotomayor believes, or believed, at least at a certain point, that a Latina woman would be better able to adjudicate certain matters than a white male, right? Because of her experiences. In a similar vein, a postmodern would perhaps say that, any minority group, any oppressed group may be better historians because of that experience. And I think an argument could be put forward for that being true, and an argument could perhaps be put forward for that being not true. But nevertheless, a postmodern would advocate for that oppressed person telling a history. Okay, so thank you so much for sticking with me as we look through the secularist, Marxist, and postmodern understandings of history. Next session, you will be looking at new spiritualist and Islamic understandings. Again, if you by chance didn't do that journal, please make sure you do that as soon as possible so that you can, add your own experience to this lecture today. Again, thank you so much.